Mark parked his black Dodge Charger in the driveway in front of the house. He's tired. The working day dragged on longer than usual. My head was buzzing with numbers and reports. The only thing he dreamed of was a hot shower and a bed. He closed the car door, pausing for a moment. The lights were on in the house. Shadows flickered in the bedroom windows. Ashley is probably still awake. Maybe he's waiting for him. The thought of his wife brought a warm smile to his face. He missed her within a day. Climbing the steps, Mark inserted the key into the lock and turned the handle. The house was quiet, too quiet. Usually Ashley greeted him, smiling, hugging, kissing. But now nothing. And then he heard moans, deaf, suppressed, filled with passion and animal pleasure. Mixed with them was the creaking of the bed, ragged breaths, and the impacts of body against body. Mark froze, and then, as if in slow motion, he slowly walked down the corridor. My heart was pounding dully in my chest, my hands clenched into fists. The mind refused to believe, but the body already knew the truth. Every movement brought him closer to destruction. Oh yes, like this, stronger, deeper. Female voice, her voice, his wives. The world before my eyes turned red. Mark tore the nearest photograph from the wall, their wedding photo, and threw it forcefully into the wall. The glass shattered, but the sounds in the bedroom did not stop. He suddenly opened the door, and I saw them. Ashley was on all fours, completely naked, her hair disheveled, her back arched, her mouth slightly open in moans. Standing behind her, holding her hips, was Jason, her damn trainer from the gym. Tall, muscular, sweaty, he had sex with her as if it was his last time. The first thing Mark felt was cold. Then everything disappeared except the rage. "Are you fucking serious?" he roared. Ashley jerked sharply, as if she had been electrocuted, and turned around. Her eyes widened in horror. Jason froze in place, frozen like a deer in front of a truck. "Mark, Shut up, bitch." Mark rushed forward. In one motion, he grabbed Jason by the neck, lifted him off the bed, and slammed him hard into the wall. The coach wheezed, waving his arms confusedly. Mark hit him in the jaw. The crack of bones was deafening. Jason collapsed to the floor, writhing in pain. I can explain everything," Ashley muttered, pulling the sheet over her chest. "Explain?" Mark turned to her, barely restraining the desire to tear the room to pieces. "What do you say, Ashley? What is this error? That it is not what it seems? What were you just wrong?" The wife burst into tears, dropping her head in her hands. Mark looked around the room. Their bed. Their damn bed. The smell of sweat. The smell of betrayal. He turned to face Jason, who was trying to get up, but Mark kicked him in the stomach, sending him crashing back to the floor. "Get dressed, you bastard, and get the fuck out of my house," he growled. "Mark, please," Ashley whined. "You too, creature. Get out of here." She jumped up, hastily grabbing her clothes. Jason pulled on his pants, somehow not daring to look up. Mark watched this with icy calm. When they were finally at the door, he opened it and forcefully pushed them out into the street. "Get out of my life, both." He slammed the door. Silence reigned in the house again. Mark took a few steps back and slowly sank onto the sofa. He looked at the wedding ring on his hand. Thoughts were pounding in my head. She betrayed me. In my house. On my bed. With some damn coach. It was as if the familiar world had cracked, opening a bottomless abyss into which everything was falling. He clenched his fingers, ready to rip the ring off and throw it to hell, but at the last moment he stopped. The ring cut my skin. "No, we need to think things through first." His heart was still pounding, his pupils were dilated with rage. The events of the past minutes seemed like some kind of bad scene from a cheap thriller, unreal, and at the same time searingly painful. Mark noticed that his hands were shaking. In addition to anger, a nagging pain appeared in my chest, a nagging awareness of loss. Images flashed before my eyes, a wedding where they laughed, kissing to loud applause, the first trip to the seaside together when they didn't get out of bed at night, their common house, which he bought, dreaming of children and a dog. Now it all seemed like empty illusions. He stood up from the sofa, straightening his back with difficulty, as if crushed by the weight of betrayal. In the mirror opposite, he saw his reflection, disheveled hair, a wild look. The muscles in his neck were tense, so that it seemed that the veins were about to burst. A picture immediately surfaced of him squeezing Jason's neck and hitting him in the face. The memory of crunching bones made Mark's jaw clench. "Damn bastard," he whispered, gripping the armrest of his chair with his fingers. "I should have killed him." A wave of anger came again, but something inside kept him from another attack of rage. "Enough. I need clarity. Calm." He looked around the room. Pieces of a broken photo frame lay in the hallway. Among them was a fragment of a wedding photo in which Ashley smiled, clinging to him. Mark slowly approached, bent down, and took this piece of paper in his hands. Wife's face, her happy, shining eyes. My memory flashed back to how she said then, "You are the best thing that happened to me in this life." He squeezed the paper. The desire to tear it in half beat within him, but instead Mark put the piece in his shirt pocket. I didn't want to burn bridges or throw new tantrums now. Too much anger, too much pain. We need to figure out what's next. As he went up to the bedroom, he felt disgusted. There was still the smell of someone else's sweat, which now seemed like the acrid stench of betrayal. The bed was rumpled, the sheet had slipped to the floor, the whole scene screamed of recent betrayal. Mark felt his gut tighten with disgust and sharply opened the window, letting in fresh air. "I'll never sleep here again," he managed. Unable to restrain himself, he pulled off the remaining sheet and angrily threw it on the floor. I noticed a telltale stain on the mattress from sweat or perhaps their shared passion. I wanted to take it all out into the yard and burn it. Burn it to hell so that not even the smell remains. However, instead, Mark walked out into the hallway and headed to the bathroom. He opened the tap, letting the water drain, and suddenly felt it shaking again. Adrenaline was boiling in the blood. The heart was pounding so that it seemed to shake the whole body. He sat down heavily on the edge of the bathtub, closed his eyes, and tried to breathe deeper. The water rumbled, raising steam, and his silhouette trembled in the mirror. A few moments later, Mark took off his shirt, threw it on the floor, and stood under the hot stream, praying that the water would wash away everything pain, rage, betrayal. But the hot drops only rolled down the skin, bringing no relief. Ashley's gaze was before my eyes, frightened, pleading, pitiful, and the way she shrank under his cry, how she made excuses. What if she wanted to leave for a long time? What if all of this was just a matter of time? Mark pressed his forehead to the tiled wall. Instead of answers, there were only questions and devastation. After several minutes that seemed like an eternity, he stepped out of the shower, quickly dried himself off, and, without bothering to look for clean clothes, walked barefoot into the living room. There, on the table, lay his phone. Call someone? Tell? To whom? He thought about his friends, about his parents, but could not make up his mind. The lump of shame and pain was too huge to throw it out. The wound is too fresh. Mark ran his fingers across the screen and opened his contact list. His gaze caught the name Ashley, next to the heart he once wrote down her number like that in a fit of love. Hands froze. The desire to press call and express everything that had accumulated struggled with complete impotence. Why talk? She had already made her choice anyway. He put the phone down and looked out the window. The night was quiet, moonless. Somewhere far away, a dog howled. The neighbors were asleep, and only a couple of houses had dim lights. Mark suddenly felt like a stranger, thrown out of his own life. The house he built for family and comfort began to resemble an empty sarcophagus, soaked in betrayal. "I need to leave," he whispered hoarsely to himself. "Just leave here." The thought of jumping into the car and driving away was alluring. But he knew that running was pointless. You can't run away from yourself. He glanced at the wedding ring, still glistening on his ring finger. His hand shook. On the verge of despair and rage, he finally tore off the ring. A pale stripe remained on the skin, the imprint of past love. The ring clanged as it fell onto the glass table and rolled like a small coin before stopping. Mark looked down at him as if he were something alien. The minutes passed, and he still stood there, unable to tear his eyes away. Inside, the realization arose that from now on his life had changed irrevocably. He understood that now was the very beginning of the path through pain, anger, humiliation, and liberation. But so far all this was just a torn cry in the chest. Through the deafening silence, he suddenly heard a muffled rustling at the door. Mark tensed. Has she really returned? Or is it Jason? He prepared himself for another outburst of rage. However, when he opened the door, there was no one behind it. Probably a draft or wind that stirred up a pile of fragments on the floor. Closing the door, Mark suddenly realized that it was approaching midnight. Recent events are like a monstrous fragment of life from which he does not know how to escape. His legs carried him into the kitchen on their own. He opened the refrigerator and took out a bottle of whiskey and a glass. His hands shook as he poured the amber liquid. He leaned against the countertop and took one long sip. The burning flame of alcohol distracted me a little from the staggering pain. He touched with his fingers the empty strip on his finger where the ring had recently been. What the fuck? He breathed quietly. So far there have been no answers. There was only raw, pulsating emotion and the thought that it was going to be a long night. He knew that tomorrow would come, and he would have to make decisions, perhaps the most difficult ones in his life. A conversation with a lawyer, filing a divorce, or maybe some other, completely dark paths. But now Mark didn't want to think. He lifted his glass and drained it to the bottom, hoping that the whiskey would at least slightly drown out the hell that was boiling inside. There was a rumble somewhere in the distance. A thunderstorm must have been approaching. Mark felt that this was a thunderstorm not only outside, but also inside himself. He had to weather a storm, after which he would never be the same again. And if he does not drown in this storm, then perhaps one day he will be able to start everything from scratch. But until then, we need to get through tonight, spend it alone with our demons. He poured more whiskey, put the bottle on the table, sat down in the darkness of the living room, and closed his eyes. And then, a second before the first reflection of lightning illuminated the windows, he quietly squeezed out into the void. Goodbye, Ashley. Mark sat in the dark living room, clasping his fingers in front of him. Several hours had already passed since he threw Ashley and her lover out the door, but his thoughts continued to spin in a frenzied whirlpool. He knew that this moment changed his whole life, but who was he now? Was he simply a victim of betrayal? Or a person who will be able to pick himself up piece by piece and move on? Mark Wilson, 35 years old, businessman, founder of his own company developing software for large corporations. His company brought him a solid income, allowing him to live in comfort and not think about money. Tall, fit, with a cool gaze and a strong character, he was never one to give up. And yet, his wife's betrayal hit him harder than any crisis he experienced in business. He remembered his childhood. He grew up in an ordinary middle-class American family. His father, Jonathan Wilson, was a firefighter, a man who risked his life to save others. Tall, strong, with an unbending will, he always instilled in Mark that men should be strong, honest, and protect those they love. His mother, Rebecca, worked as a journalist for a local newspaper, writing articles about social issues and investigating high-profile cases. Her pen was sharp, and her spirit was unbending. She always told Mark, "Ask questions, never accept the world as it is. Always seek the truth." Life in their small house on the outskirts of Chicago was far from luxurious, but Mark grew up in an atmosphere of discipline and respect for work. He remembered the smell of coffee that his mother brewed early in the morning while she was working on the next material, the smell of burning from his father's uniform, who returned from duty exhausted but proud of his work. He remembered the noisy family kitchen, where in the evenings they would gather together, discussing the day, exchanging jokes, and arguing. As a teenager, he worked part-time after school. First, he delivered newspapers, then he worked in an electronics store, where he learned to fix computers and understand programming. This work led him to his first real passion, code. He would sit at a keyboard for hours, developing simple algorithms and learning how systems worked. His father approved of his aspirations, but always reminded him, "You can work with your head, but remember that your strength lies in who you are and not just in what you can do." After graduating from school, Mark entered the University of Illinois. He had to work nights at its startups to pay for his studies. He wrote code, developed interfaces, and advised students. This period tempered him, made him hardworking and ambitious. He didn't just create programs, he learned to see the future, manage people, and find non-standard solutions. After graduating from university, he got a job at a large technology company. There, he quickly climbed the career ladder, but working for someone else depressed him. He always dreamed of creating something of his own. At the age of 28, he quit his job, risking everything, and founded his own company. The first years were difficult. There was not enough investment. We had to work for days, look for clients, and get burned by the first mistakes. But Mark didn't give up. He put all his strength, all his money, all his time into the business, and it paid off. By the age of 33, he became the owner of one of the most promising companies in the country. He was always told that with a character like his, he would succeed, and he really achieved it. He had a house, expensive cars, and a stable business. But most importantly, he had Ashley, the woman he once fell madly in love with. He remembered how they met. It was a banal evening at a bar. He was then celebrating his first major deal, was a little drunk and happy. She approached him first, confident, impressive, with that very smile that floored him. They talked for hours, laughed, and then could not part. Everything was so simple, so easy. It seemed that he had met his soul mate. And now this half is torn to shreds. Mark took a deep breath. He was no longer the man who believed in unconditional love. Now he was a man who had been betrayed. And he knew one thing: he would not allow anyone to do this to him again. Mark slowly ran his hand over his face, feeling tired and empty. His thoughts went back to her Ashley. He once considered her perfect. She was the one for whom he was ready to move mountains, the one with whom he wanted to build a family. But who was she really? Ashley Harrison, 32, is a marketing specialist for a large cosmetics company. Her career was successful. She had natural charisma, the ability to persuade and promote any product. She knew how to be the center of attention and attract people to her. Her smile could make anyone forget about their problems. Her self-confidence bordered on insolence. It was this courage of hers that captivated Mark. They met 7 years ago at a corporate event. Mark was just starting to build his company, and Ashley was already working in the marketing department and conducting presentations of new cosmetic products. He couldn't take his eyes off her. She was stunning, slim, with long blonde hair, perfect posture, and eyes full of fire. She spoke with such confidence that even the most skeptical people in the room listened to her with admiration. After her speech, Mark approached her. They started talking. The conversation turned into light flirting. He admired her intelligence and charisma, and she admired his ambition and determination. She knew how to carry on a conversation, challenge him, playfully tease him, making him laugh. Their connection arose instantly, and soon they could no longer imagine life without each other. Their first date took place in an expensive restaurant on the roof of a skyscraper. She came in a tight black dress that emphasized her impeccable figure. Mark couldn't take his eyes off her. They drank wine and talked about everything: careers, dreams, travel. They had so much in common, or at least he thought so at the time. The novel developed rapidly. 6 months later, he invited her to move in together. They bought a cozy apartment in the city center, furnished it together, discussing every detail. He saw her caring, gentle, devoted. She inspired him to new achievements and supported him when he doubted himself. There was always laughter in their house, wine flowed like a river, and the nights were full of passion. 2 years after they met, he proposed to her. It was perfectly planned: a romantic trip to Paris, dinner on the terrace overlooking the Eiffel Tower, a diamond ring that he had chosen with the utmost care. She burst into tears of happiness, repeating, "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." He was sure that he had found his one and only. The wedding was magnificent. They rented a country mansion. There were more than 200 guests. She looked like a queen in a snow-white dress, and he looked like a man who had everything. They swore eternal love to each other, looked into each other's eyes, and believed that their happiness would last forever. But the years passed. The ideal began to crack. Mark began to notice that Ashley spent more time at work, often stayed late, and paid less attention to him. She always looked perfect, but now she cared about how she looked to others. He began to feel that their marriage was becoming a formality. They lived under the same roof, but as if in different worlds. He remembered the day when he first suspected something was wrong. She came home late. The smell of her perfume was stronger than usual. Her makeup was carelessly wiped off. She avoided his gaze, quickly took a shower, and went to bed without even kissing him good night. Then he drove away the bad thoughts, blaming everything on fatigue. Now he hated himself for this naivety. Mark clenched his fists. He loved her. I gave her the best years of my life. Ashley has always taken pride in her appearance. Her job in marketing required not only the ability to persuade, but also an impeccable appearance. She always took good care of herself: makeup, hairstyle, well-groomed nails. But after several years of marriage, she began to notice changes. In the mirror, she saw not the same girl who had conquered Mark 7 years ago. A slight fatigue appeared in the eyes. The soft contours of the body no longer looked as toned as before. The turning point was a conversation with a friend during a bachelorette party. "Ashley, you used to be in amazing shape," Rachel said, examining her carefully. "You still look gorgeous, but if you want to stay on top, the gym is your best friend." These words struck a chord with her. Her vanity, her desire to be perfect. That same night, she lay in bed next to Mark, who had long since fallen asleep, and scrolled through websites with the best gyms in the city. She chose the most expensive, most prestigious. The one where successful people train, where you can not only tone your figure, but also make useful contacts. The next day, she signed the contract. The first classes were difficult. Her muscles ached. Sweat interfered with her beautiful image. But this did not stop her. She trained with complete dedication, burning away all her doubts and insecurities. She felt her body taking shape again, her clothes starting to fit differently, her confidence growing every day. And then he appeared, Jason Carter. Tall, athletic, tanned. One of the best trainers in the gym, the one who had a line of clients wanting his attention. He was the embodiment of masculinity, strength, charisma. "Are you new?" he asked when she was once again struggling with the leg press. "Yes, I'm trying to get back into shape," she smiled, straightening her hair. "I could help if you want," he offered, leaning closer. And that was the beginning. Ashley has always been a confident woman. She is used to keeping everything under control: her career, appearance, family life. But with Jason, it was different. He was a danger, a fire that beckoned her, even though she knew she could get burned. She tried to convince herself that it was just a hobby, that she was only attracted to him because he was her coach. But with each new lesson, he penetrated deeper into her thoughts. Their romance began almost by accident, or perhaps it seemed so only to her. After one of the workouts, Jason suggested that she stay 15 minutes longer to show her some new exercises. Around 10 in the evening, the hall was almost empty. Only a couple of people were doing stretches in front of the mirrors. He walked up behind her, his hands sliding over her shoulders, correcting her posture, then lingering a moment longer than necessary. "Relax," he whispered in a low voice. She felt a heat run through her entire body. This was something new. Mark had never spoken to her in that tone, had never touched her like that. She knew it was wrong, but the desire pierced her stronger than the guilt. A few days later, she stayed after training again. They stood side by side, breathing heavily after intense exercise. He smiled at her, wiping sweat from his forehead. "You're doing a good job, Ashley." His gaze lingered on her face a little longer than it should have. "But you can do more." She swallowed the lump in her throat. "Will you show me?" And he showed. He showed it again and again, but not only in the hall. Their secret meetings became more and more bold. First short conversations after training, then messages late at night. Then the first meeting outside the gym. A hotel rented for a couple of hours, the smell of sweat mixed with her perfume, hot touches that she had never experienced with Mark. She felt like a different woman next to Jason. He didn't ask questions or discuss plans for the future. He simply took her, making her forget about everything. It was an animal attraction, something forbidden, devoid of obligations. She knew this was not love. It was an addiction, and the deeper she sank, the less she wanted to stop. The next morning, Mark woke up with a heaviness in his chest. He barely slept, lying in the dark and reliving the events of the previous night. Ashley's betrayal hit him in waves, crashing into his consciousness with renewed vigor. Pain, anger, disgust. He looked at the ceiling, trying to convince himself that this was reality, that this really happened. But the worst thing was that even knowing this, he could still smell her on the pillow. This smell was once familiar, beloved, but now it seemed unbearable. He slowly got out of bed and walked into the bathroom. The icy water falling from his face did not wash away the betrayal. It soaked into his skin, burned into his mind. The doorbell rang. He knew who it was. He didn't open it right away. Let him wait. Let him feel at least a fraction of what he felt. Let him stand in the cold morning wind. Let him tremble with uncertainty, as he trembled last night when he heard her moans in his bedroom. Several minutes passed. Another ring, then a light knock. He slowly walked towards the door. Every second was difficult for him. A voice filled with anger and resentment sounded in his head, but he forced himself to calm down. Don't show weakness. When he opened it, Ashley stood in front of him. His hair is disheveled, his face is swollen from tears, his clothes are wrinkled. She looked broken. In his hands is a large bag. She looked like someone who had lost everything. But was she truly lost? Mark. Her voice trembled, but there was hope in it. Hope for what? For forgiveness. That he will take her back? He was silent, glaring at her. I waited for her to speak, but I wasn't going to make it easy for her. I came to get my things, she whispered, lowering her head. He took a step back to let her pass. She entered slowly, as if she was afraid that he would stop her or hit her with a word. There was tension in the air, so thick that it seemed you could touch it. She walked into the bedroom and stopped when she saw scattered things, traces of the previous night. The fragments of their lives scattered across the room. Her eyes lingered on the broken photo frame, where not long ago they were smiling, seeming like a happy couple. I I don't know what to say, she sobbed, pressing her hand to her lips. I'm sorry, Mark. It was a mistake. Monstrous mistake. I don't know what came over me. I didn't mean to hurt you. It was. Her voice broke. I don't know how it got this far. He crossed his arms over his chest, continuing to glare at her with an icy gaze. Error. His voice was saturated with coldness and contempt. You call this a mistake? A mistake is forgetting to close the door. A mistake is to confuse the date in a document. And you knowingly had sex with someone else in our house. In our bed. Did you call him the same as me? She closed her eyes, sobbing, tears running down her cheeks. I love you, Mark. I didn't mean. Don't you dare. His voice became sharp, almost cutting. Don't say those words. Love. You have no idea what this means. She took a step towards him, extending her hand, but he immediately pulled away, as if touching something poisonous. I'm ready to fix everything. Her voice became pleading and trembling. I know it's unforgivable, but I was stupid, I was confused. This doesn't mean I don't love you. Please, Mark, can we try? He looked at her coldly, without blinking. We? No, Ashley. There is no us here anymore. You ruined everything. I'm filing for divorce. This is not even discussed. She gasped, shaking her head, her fingers clenching on her bag. No, Mark, please don't say that. Give me a chance. Chance? He smiled bitterly. You've already taken your chance, Ashley. You have made your choice. Now live with it. She looked crushed. Her shoulders slumped, her lips trembled. But he felt no pity. Take your things and leave. She didn't move. Her eyes darted around the room as if she was trying to find something that could save her, something she could cling to. But there was nothing, only an ice wall between them. Mark, I can't just leave. You loved me. I was your wife. It was, he said. Now you're just the person I once knew. Mark turned away and left the room. Mark sat on the edge of the bed, staring at one point. His thoughts uncontrollably carried him back into the past, to where everything seemed simple and bright. He closed his eyes, letting the memories wash over him. Their wedding. It was a warm summer day. Ashley walked towards him in a snow-white dress, as if she had stepped off the cover of a magazine. Her eyes shone, she smiled that very smile that he loved more than anything in the world. As she approached, her hand gently fell into his, and at that moment it seemed to him that they were not just getting married, but finding each other again. They laughed, they danced. He remembered how at the end of the evening, tired but happy, they ran away from the guests onto the balcony to simply enjoy the silence and each other. She pressed herself close to him and whispered, "I love you so much, Mark. I promise that we will always be together." Then these words seemed indestructible, carved in stone. Then his memories took him to their first apartment. Small, cozy, full of laughter and love. They spent hours discussing their future and making plans. They wanted children. 2, maybe 3. Ashley dreamed of a house by the lake, and he dreamed of a large yard where their children would play with the dog. They planned trips, imagined growing old together, holding each other's hands. Mark ran his hand over his face, feeling his chest tighten. All this happened. It all seemed real. But now, he opened his eyes and looked at the empty room. Instead of joy, there is emptiness. Instead of dreams, there are ruins. Instead of forever, goodbye. The contrast between past and present was painful and destructive. He sighed and clenched his fists. There was no point in clinging to the memories, but they wouldn't let him go. What was true? Those moments that once warmed his heart, or that cold horror that settled inside him now? Mark wasn't going to just sit and chew on his pain. He wasn't the kind of person to put his head down and let someone ruin his life without consequences. Anger pulsed through his blood, demanding an outlet, and he knew what he had to do. Jason Carter. Strong, confident, self-satisfied. He must have felt invincible fucking other people's wives while their husbands worked. Mark wasn't going to leave it just like that. From the very beginning, Mark decided to act methodically. He created a separate folder on his computer where he put every detail he found, every little thing, reviews, screenshots from social networks, comments in forums. Some of the posts were old, with dates from a year ago, but they already contained similar hints about the too close coach. Others were completely new. Users complained about too intrusive compliments or friendly touches. Individually, this may have seemed like a trifle, but taken together it became a menacing picture. An important step was visiting the gym, but Mark avoided a direct meeting. He rented a small apartment nearby, where he could sit quietly in his car and watch clients. Every morning at 7 o'clock sharp, Jason arrived in a gray SUV. He smiled at everyone who came his way, and his smile was confident, self-confident, exactly the kind that infuriated Mark the most. Through the wide glass of the gym, part of the gym was visible. Sometimes Mark saw Jason helping clients, apparently especially those who were not yet very familiar with the equipment. He leaned close to them, touching their hips or back, showing the correct position. Sometimes from the outside it could look almost innocent, but the habits were too intimate. Mark noticed how some girls smiled at him, while others seemed embarrassed or even tense. 2 weeks of observations confirmed everything Mark had read in the reviews. Jason started talking to young clients, sometimes keeping them after their workouts. And here is one of them, a fragile student named Anya, judging by the bracelet with the inscription on her hand. She was clearly nervous when Jason spoke to her. He became too persistent, showed her something on his phone, and she just lowered her eyes. Mark didn't hear the words, but he knew from the girl's expression that she didn't like it. One evening, when training was over and almost no one was left in the gym, Mark caught the moment when Jason and Anya walked out side by side through the service exit. The girl looked confused, as if she didn't know what to do with herself. Jason seemed to be insisting on something, gesturing with the phone, perhaps trying to get her number or trying to persuade her to meet outside the hall. At that moment, Mark felt rage flare up in his chest. But he managed to maintain control. He took out his smartphone and took several pictures. This was the key he had been waiting for. Photos, short videos, screenshots, everything that could be sent to the management of the hall and on social networks. The work began quietly at night over a cup of bitter coffee. Mark created an anonymous account and began sending out materials. He was careful about who he wrote to and phrased his messages so that they sounded convincing and non-provocative. He knew that if he pushed too hard, people might think it was all fake or an act of revenge. But these recordings were real evidence, and this was quite enough to sow doubt. First, he wrote to the gym management. I attached photos and indicated in the subject line, inappropriate behavior of Coach Jason Carter materials for internal review. He then sent messages to a popular city group where local businesses and services were often discussed, as well as to several bloggers who specialized in exposing untrustworthy workers. It only took a couple of days and the first reactions appeared. Someone commented on the post in the group, saying that they themselves had experienced Carter's obsessive behavior. Some, on the contrary, defended him as the best coach who is just friendly. But the main result was achieved. Jason no longer looked untouchable. The next morning, there was a tense atmosphere outside the gym. Mark, as usual, arrived and sat in his car. He noticed how several employees and clients crowded around the entrance, excitedly talking about something. Jason stepped out of the car, seeming to try to maintain his usual confidence, but there was a hint of nervousness in his posture. He tried to explain something to his colleagues, but they looked puzzled and were clearly not too happy to see him. After some time, one of the employees of the hall, apparently an administrator, walked inside without even looking him in the eye. At lunchtime, there was a short, closed meeting of management. Mark couldn't get there, but he saw the gym director and two other managers enter the office, closing the doors behind them. Jason looked tense as he walked by, as if he knew that something was going wrong, and he would still have to answer for his actions. By evening, screenshots of correspondence with the same student he persistently pursued began to circulate on social networks. It seems that the girl, feeling supported and seeing that she was not alone, decided to stop being silent and told details about Jason's constant hints and attempts to schedule personal training at his home. Her friend posted this on her story, tagging the gym's account. The information was unfolding before our eyes. Mark, sitting at his computer, looked through the comments with cold determination. Many wrote that Carter behaved like a real predator, and that perhaps there were more such cases than it seems. Some recalled similar stories, others reposted them, outraged by the inaction of management. But the management was no longer inactive. The manager in charge soon published a laconic statement that an investigation was underway, and if the facts were confirmed, the coach would be suspended from work. The more the noise grew, the more satisfied Mark felt. Jason Carter began to lose ground. Someone who was used to being the center of attention and enjoying the status of a gym star suddenly found himself under a barrage of accusations and gossip. The reputation he had built over the years was crumbling right before his eyes. A hurricane was raging inside Mark. He thought that revenge would bring him relief, but it did not. Every new day was a struggle with myself, with emotions, with the emptiness that settled inside. He felt like his life was falling apart, like something inside him was breaking and refusing to come back together. He began to spend more time in the gym. The iron, the rattle of the barbell against the racks, the pain in the muscles, all of this somehow helped to drown out the pain in my heart. Mark trained to the point of exhaustion, to the point where his body refused to obey and his mind plunged into emptiness. He hit the bag, imagining Jason's face, over and over until all that was left was a thud and beads of sweat falling onto the mats. Everything at work went downhill. He forgot about meetings, lashed out at employees, and couldn't concentrate. His company had always been his pride, but now he didn't care. One of his top managers cautiously entered the office and asked, "Mark, what's wrong with you? You are not yourself." He didn't answer, he just waved it off, continuing to stare into space. A single thought was spinning inside him. Why? Why did she cheat? Every time he tried to find an answer, he found himself at a dead end. They had a good life, stability, love, or so he thought. Ashley didn't suffer, didn't need anything. Then why? Was he insufficient, not attentive enough, not passionate enough? He was at a loss, replaying all their conversations over the past months. He looked for hints, signals, warnings that he might have missed, but he found only emptiness. One night he sat down at the kitchen table, placed a bottle of whiskey in front of him, and poured himself a full glass. He drank slowly, trying to drown out the voice inside, but it did not stop. She cheated on you because you weren't the only one for her, because she wanted something else, because you didn't notice it yourself. He closed his eyes, gritting his teeth tightly. He was not weak. I couldn't be weak. But now he felt overwhelmed, empty. And worst of all, despite all the anger and pain, he still couldn't get her out of his head. Mark heard the doorbell ring late in the evening. He didn't expect guests and didn't even watch TV. He just sat in the semi-darkness, staring at the wall. His heart sank when he looked through the peephole. Ashley. He opened the door, leaning his hand on the frame. She looked tired. Her face was pale. Her eyes were red, as if she had been crying for a long time. "We need to talk." Her voice was quiet, almost broken. Mark grinned and crossed his arms over his chest, trying not to show off the surging anxiety. "About what?" "About how you and Jason are doing." "How is he doing after my visit?" Ashley flinched as if she had been hit. There was a tension in the air, as if something intangible but frighteningly real stood between them. "This is not about him. This is about us. About you." She sighed heavily, as if she needed considerable effort to say the next phrase. "I'm pregnant, Mark." He was silent for several seconds. Surprise, fear, resentment, everything mixed into an incomprehensible tangle. Finally, he squeezed out, "Well, congratulations." His voice sounded cold and distant. "Just one question. Is this my child, or are you not sure?" Ashley's bottom lip trembled. She clenched her fist, trying to cope with the feelings that overwhelmed her. I don't know," she admitted, not finding the strength to lie. Mark laughed a short, sharp laugh without a trace of joy. "Of course you don't know. How can you know if you've been jumping from one bed to another?" Ashley bit her lip and looked away. "Mark, please. I'm confused. I made a mistake. But it's true, I don't know who the child is from. And I don't want him to grow up without a father. If he's yours." Mark took a step forward. Ashley, recoiling, involuntarily stepped back. He saw the fear in her eyes, and it strangely gave him a feeling of gloomy superiority. "Do you know that your Jason is not just some kind of coach, but a real womanizer?" Mark muttered, looking her straight in the eyes. "He's already been through this with other women. He seduced his clients, slept with them, and then disappeared. Maybe you're next?" Her eyes widened in shock. This is not true." She said this more to herself than to him, as if she was trying to convince herself. "Sure?" Mark leaned closer. "I saw evidence, talked to people. With one of them, he also waited until she announced she was pregnant and then ran away. Do you think a different fate awaits you?" Ashley closed her eyes, and her face was distorted from internal pain. "I don't know. I don't know what to do," she whispered, as if losing her last stronghold. Mark stepped back and ran his hand over her face, peering into her despair. In the depths of his soul, he wanted to stop all this, to hold her close to him, to tell her that everything would be fine. But pride and resentment screamed louder within him. "So what now?" he asked, trying to keep his voice even. "Have you come to me for salvation, for forgiveness? Do you think I will forget everything and sit and wait for the birth of a baby who may not be from me? Ashley bit her lip so hard that a drop of blood came out. "I should have told you in person. I understood that you would find out sooner or later, and I don't want to lie. I'm confused, but I'm scared to think that this child could be left without a father." Mark smiled bitterly. "I'll tell you what will happen," he said harshly. "We will wait for the birth of the child. Let's do a DNA test. If it's not my child, you'll never see me again. She stood in the hallway, as if backed into a corner, looking down at the floor, not daring to raise her eyes. What if? She finally spoke, almost in a whisper. What if he's still yours? He crossed his arms over his chest, trying to drown out the panic that rose in his chest like a quiet stab of pain. Then I'll take responsibility, he said. But that doesn't mean I'll forget how you betrayed me. You will have to prove for a long time that you are worthy of trust. Ashley sobbed and covered her face with her hands. For several seconds they stood there in silence, listening only to the beating of their hearts and the muffled sounds of the night outside the door. Mark, she finally whispered, lowering her hands and looking at him with endless sadness. I'm really sorry. I know how it sounds, but I didn't mean to hurt you. Everything got out of control. Anger flared in his eyes. For a moment he wanted to reveal everything he thought about her, to shout, to accuse her. But something inside stopped him, as if reminding him, she suffers too. Do you think this makes me feel better? He asked in response. You think I don't feel betrayed? She was silent, head down. Mark realized that her confusion was the very punishment she herself became a victim of her mistakes. And despite his own pain, he felt some strange satisfaction. He should have been the one who was betrayed, and now she was trapped, where there were no simple answers and no easy ways back. He shook his head, taking a step to the side to make way for her to leave. Go, Ashley. His voice sounded quieter than a minute ago. I need time to think about everything. And you better decide what you really want. She nodded, barely sobbing a thank you. And without raising her eyes, she left the apartment into the night, leaving Mark in the corridor with an agonizing feeling of loss and a bitter desire to turn back time at least a little. After the door closed, Mark leaned against the wall and closed his eyes. It seemed to him that his heart was being squeezed in a vice. He always imagined himself as a strong, confident man, someone who knows what he wants from life. But this situation destroyed all illusions. Now he couldn't understand what hurt more: the possibility of losing a child who could have been his, or accepting him and continuing to live, knowing that Ashley had once exchanged him for another. In the silence and semi-darkness of his own corridor, he suddenly realized that a new night had come, the longest of his life, and that he has as much uncertainty ahead as Ashley, if not more. Mark sat alone for a long time, staring at one point. His mind raced between hatred and doubt. An inner voice insisted that he should not give in, that she had betrayed him, that she should no longer be in his life. But there was one nuance that he could not ignore. What if the child was really his? He couldn't afford to turn his back on a possible child of his own. No matter how much anger he seethed, he was not a man who abandoned responsibility. Mark sighed heavily. The next morning he dialed her number. Ashley answered with a tremble in her voice, as if she had been waiting for this call. Come, he said briefly. An hour later, she stood on his threshold. There is anxiety, fear, and hope in the eyes. He looked at her coldly, but led her inside. You will stay here until the birth, but there are conditions. She nodded, ready for anything. We sleep in different rooms. There is nothing between us. His gaze was cold, as if he was talking to a stranger. Ashley nodded again, pursing her lips. Further, no sex, no hints, no attempts to fix everything. You ruined our marriage, and I don't need false intimacy. She looked away but didn't object. And the last thing, Mark paused, looking straight into her eyes. We're going to therapy, joint consultations, not in order to fix us, but in order to understand how we will interact further. First of all, for the sake of the child. Ashley looked at him, her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't argue. Okay, she whispered. Mark nodded, crossed his arms, and took a deep breath. And remember, his voice became firmer. As soon as the baby is born, we will do a DNA test. If he is mine, we will try to figure out what to do next. Maybe we'll have a chance to save something. But if not... He paused, his eyes flashing with cold contempt. Then you can go to hell and never bother me again. Ashley swallowed but didn't say anything. She understood. This was her last chance. 2 weeks have passed since Ashley returned to the house. These days passed painfully slowly, saturated with tension and coldness. They lived under the same roof, but as if on different planets. They talked only when necessary, avoided making eye contact, and ate dinner at different times. Every evening passed the same way in silence, filled with dull tension. Even the sounds of her footsteps along the corridor irritated Mark, although he tried not to think about her. Mark got up before her, went to work, and in the evening tried to stay in the office as long as possible. Returning home, he invariably felt tense silence. The house became too quiet, too sterile. Nothing remained of their former closeness. Sometimes he would sit in his room, staring at the ceiling, wondering why he had even let her come back. The answer was simple: a child. It was only because of the child that he tolerated her presence. Ashley tried not to get in his way. She minded her own business, spent a lot of time in her room, sometimes watched TV in the living room, but immediately left as soon as she heard Mark's steps. It was an unspoken rule. They exist side by side, but do not intersect. Even at the table, when they had to sit opposite each other, they hardly spoke. Only rare phrases concerning food or everyday issues broke this oppressive silence. One evening, he walked into the kitchen when she was already sitting at the table with a cup of tea. Their eyes met for a second, but Ashley immediately looked away. Mark opened the refrigerator, took out a bottle of water, and wanted to leave, but stopped. "How do you feel?" he asked unexpectedly for himself. She looked up, surprised that he had even spoken to her. "It's okay." Her voice was quiet. "I'm getting a little tired." He nodded, taking a sip of water. She watched him, waiting to see if he would say anything else, but he simply turned around and went into his room. However, upon entering there, he sat for a long time on the edge of the bed, replaying their short conversation in his head. Why did he even talk to her? Why did he care? At night, Mark often woke up, hearing her quiet sobs from behind the wall. She cried almost every night, but he didn't allow himself to react. He didn't care, shouldn't have cared. He repeated this to himself over and over again. But deep down he understood, he cared. One night he went out into the corridor, stopped near her door, and listened. She was crying again. He clenched his fists, turned around, and returned to his room, angry at himself for this outburst. A few days later, he noticed Ashley holding her lower back, wincing slightly in pain. He knew that pregnancy was difficult, that it was not easy for her. He told himself that it was not his place to take care of her. But that evening, he left a pack of prenatal vitamins on the kitchen table, without words, without comment. In the morning, the packaging was gone. She took them. Responsibility for her and the child did not give him peace. Despite everything, he could not completely ignore her suffering. But could he ever trust her again? It was a question to which he did not yet know the answer. Mark sat in a chair with a tense expression on his face, crossing his arms over his chest. Ashley sat nearby, slightly slouched. She looked nervous, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her sweater. In front of them, at a large oak table, sat Dr. Harris, their family therapist, an older man with piercing eyes and gray hair in his close-cropped hair. He looked at them carefully, holding a notepad and pen. "Okay," Dr. Harris began, leaning back in his chair. "Today is our first session, and I would like you to be as honest as possible with each other. I'm not here to judge. I'm here to help you figure it out. Mark, Ashley, why did you decide to come to me?" Mark gritted his teeth, then sighed heavily. "It's her idea," he muttered, nodding towards his wife. Ashley swallowed quietly and spoke. "Because I want us to at least try to understand what happened to us. Why did everything fall apart the way it did?" Her voice trembled, but she tried to speak confidently. Dr. Harris turned his gaze to Mark. "And you, Mark? How do you feel about this idea?" "I think it's useless," he snapped. "She betrayed me. What's there to take apart? Everything is obvious. I was a good husband, and she betrayed me." "Mark," the doctor said softly, "betrayal is always painful. But marriage is a complex system, and it is rarely the case that only one person is to blame. I want to understand what preceded this event. Ashley, tell us how you felt in your marriage before the betrayal." Ashley looked away, collecting her thoughts. Then she spoke quietly. I felt lonely. She glanced quickly at Mark, then looked away again. We lived together, but as if separately. You were always busy with work, always in your business, in your affairs. I don't blame you. I understand that you tried for us, but I felt like I was in the background. Sometimes I even thought that you didn't notice me. Mark huffed in irritation. So, in your opinion, this is an excuse. Did you sleep with someone else because I was working? No, Ashley flushed. This is not an excuse. This is the explanation. I don't want to make excuses. I just want you to understand that there were cracks in our marriage long before this. I was looking for confirmation that someone still needed me, that I still have value. Dr. Harris nodded. A feeling of invisibility in marriage is one of the common causes of crises in relationships. But Ashley, have you tried telling Mark about this? About feeling unwanted? Ashley nodded, but uncertainty. Yes, but he didn't hear me, or didn't want to hear. Every time I started talking about how I lacked his attention, he brushed it off. He said, I'm busy, I'm tired, I'm working for us. At some point, I just stopped trying. Mark clasped his hands. It's so convenient, right? You didn't even try. You just found the first one who smiled at you and decided that this was the way out. Dr. Harris raised his hand to stop him. Mark, I understand your anger. This is a natural reaction. But let's try not to blame each other, but to get to the root of the problem. Have you really noticed that Ashley feels lonely? Mark was silent. He wanted to say no, but something inside him didn't allow it. He remembered all those evenings when he would come home late and Ashley would sit cross-legged in the living room, clearly waiting for him. I remembered her disappointed sighs when he answered her in monosyllables, burying his face in the phone. He remembered the moments when he saw sadness in her eyes, but did not try to understand the reason. He cleared his throat, not knowing what to say. Maybe I really didn't notice. Maybe I was too focused on work. Ashley looked up at him in surprise. Dr. Harris smiled slightly. This is already a step forward. Recognizing a problem is the first step to solving it. The question is, do you both want to figure out what happened and try to change something? Mark looked at Ashley, then looked away again. I don't know, he admitted honestly. Ashley nodded, her lips trembling. I understand, but I want to try. I want you to understand me. At least a little. Dr. Harris sighed. So we have something to work on. In the next session, we will try to figure out exactly what moments led you to this point. In the meantime, try to listen to each other at least a little. No charges. Just listen. Mark knew that simply ruining Jason's reputation wasn't enough. He was too self-confident, too used to getting out. A simple dismissal will not stop him. He will find another room, another job, new victims. No, Mark wanted this man to feel real fear, so that his name would become a curse, so that the doors would close in front of him forever. He began to think through a plan. Jason was a master manipulator, but Mark had one advantage: he was smarter. He knew how to create a situation where Jason would have no way out. The first step was to find someone who could play the victim role. Mark turned to one of Jason's former clients, a girl named Sarah. He found out about her when he was collecting information about the trainer's adventures. She was young, beautiful, and ambitious, but after communicating with Jason, she lost confidence in herself. He promised her success in fitness, a special approach, but in the end, he turned her into just another toy. When Mark met her, she initially did not want to participate in his plan, but he showed her the correspondence records and other evidence of his victims. He broke me, Sarah whispered, clenching her fists. I won't let him do this to anyone else. And so the plan began to take shape. Sarah agreed to play the role of a new victim, but now everything had to be as careful as possible. Sarah returned to the gym as if nothing had happened. She started training again, communicating with Jason again, but this time she recorded every conversation. Mark prepared a hidden microphone in advance, which helped record evidence. A few days later, Jason made his first mistake. He started with compliments, then invited Sarah to private lessons indoors. This is exactly what Mark was waiting for. When Jason invited Sarah to his apartment for personal training, they were ready. Mark watched her every move. On the appointed evening, the girl came to him, but two more people were waiting outside the door, a private detective and a lawyer. They recorded the entire conversation as Jason started making lewd references, saying that if she be a good girl, her career would take off. At that moment, the doors swung open. "Hey, bastard," Mark said, walking inside. Jason turned pale. "What the hell?" Mark threw the recorder on the table. "This is a recording. Evidence that you are blackmailing clients. Do you think there will be at least one gym in this city that will hire you after this? Do you think the police won't be interested?" Jason clutched his head, breathing heavily. "Mark, listen." "No, now listen," Mark interrupted him. "You either disappear from this city or we hand it all over to the police, your former employers, and the media. Decide." Jason was silent for several seconds. Then he took off, grabbed his keys, and ran out of the apartment. Mark exhaled. He knew that he would leave. Forever. The final blow had been struck. Mark remained impenetrable. His anger continued despite Ashley's best efforts to make their lives a little less stressful. He noticed how hard she tried cleaning the house, preparing dinners, even leaving coffee on the table for him before leaving for work. But his heart remained closed. Each of her gestures looked to him like pathetic atonement, like another attempt to make amends. He wasn't going to forgive her. He did not forget that she destroyed his life, their family, and no amount of hot food or caring looks could change that. Everything she did irritated him even more. Any manifestation of her concern seemed false and hypocritical. One evening he returned home, tired after a long day of work. The aroma of baked meat and spices hung in the air. He entered the kitchen and saw the table set. In its place stood a plate of dinner, a napkin neatly folded next to it, and Ashley sat opposite. She looked a little nervous, but tried to smile. "I prepared dinner," she said quietly. "I thought you'd like it." Mark slowly took off his jacket and threw it over the back of the chair. He didn't sit down. He just looked at her, coldly, carefully. Then, without saying a word, he took the plate and dumped the food into the trash can. Ashley shuddered, her eyes immediately filling with tears. "You didn't even try." "I didn't ask you to cook," he answered calmly. "Don't think that a couple of dinners will change what you did." She lowered her head and clenched her hands into fists. Mark saw how hurt she was, but did not allow himself to feel pity. Her moans were still echoing in his mind from the night he found her with another man. Every attempt to get closer to him only caused more disgust. "I just wanted." Her voice trembled. "I wanted to show that I care." He grinned. "Do you care now? It's a little late, Ashley." She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to hold back the tears. "I understand that I cannot expect forgiveness from you," she whispered, "but at least I can show that I'm ready to do everything to atone for my guilt. I don't expect you to immediately believe me." Mark came closer, towering over her. "Atone for guilt?" he repeated, his voice icy. "You think that after everything you've done, dinner will fix the situation, or a caring look? I don't believe you, Ashley. I don't believe a single word you say." She wanted to say something, but changed her mind. Her shoulders slumped, her breathing hitched. Mark turned away and walked into his room, loudly slamming the door behind him. Left alone, Ashley sat down on a chair, covered her face with her hands, and burst into tears. Mark woke up in the middle of the night, feeling strangely restless. He lay in the dark, listening to the silence of the house, but after a few seconds he heard a faint sound. Quiet, muffled. Crying. The sound came from the next room. Ashley. He clenched his teeth and turned to the wall, trying to ignore it, but the tears sounded so sincere, so heartbreaking that he could not simply turn off his emotions. She was not just crying out of sadness, it was the same deep, hopeless cry of a person who had lost everything. And the worst thing was that he knew that she had lost him. Mark closed his eyes, trying to block it out. Her problems, her guilt, her tears, let her cry. But something inside him protested. It scratched from the inside and did not allow me to fall asleep again. He rolled over and covered his ears with his hands, but the sound of her quiet sobs was still clear. It was as if he was cutting him alive. He remained in the same position for several minutes, hoping that the sound would subside, but it did not subside. On the contrary, the sobs only became louder and then suddenly broke into a hoarse sigh. He heard her try to stop her tears, but she couldn't. Crap. He slowly sat up, ran his hand over his face, and exhaled heavily. His heart was beating faster than he would have liked. He didn't know why it bothered him. He didn't have to take care of her. She betrayed him. But something inside still shrank from her sobs. This pain was too real. He remembered moments from the past. Once he himself held her in his arms when she cried. I remembered how I stroked her hair, how I consoled her when she had problems at work, when she had bad days. Then it seemed to him that her tears were something that he was obliged to erase, her pain was his responsibility. But now everything was different. Or not. He stood up, walked to the door of his room, and put his hand on the handle. He stood there for several seconds. An inner voice shouted, "Don't you dare. She doesn't need you. Let her suffer." But there were other voices. Voices from the past, from those times when he loved her, when he cared about her, when he saw in her the very woman with whom he wanted to live his whole life. He slowly placed his forehead against the wooden surface of the door, closing his eyes. Something pinched in my chest. An internal conflict strangled him like a noose around his neck. With one movement, he could open the door, say something. But what? What could he say that didn't sound like weakness, like self-betrayal? He didn't open the door. He just stood there. For a long time. I listened closely. At some point, the sobs subsided, but he knew that the tears had not stopped. They simply went deeper, to where he could not hear them. Finally, he removed his hand from the doorknob and slowly returned to his bed. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling. The pain inside did not subside. He couldn't console her. Not now. Not after everything. But he also couldn't pretend that her pain didn't affect him. Chapter 17, Second Therapy Session. Mark sat in a chair, his fingers tightly clenched. Opposite him is Ashley, slouched and looking down. Dr. Harris sat between them, like a ring judge, flipping through notes on a notepad. Second session. Mark didn't know why he came here. Did he want to hear something that would help him forgive? Or, on the contrary, to finally become convinced that forgiveness is impossible? Dr. Harris looked up from his notes and looked at Ashley. In the last session, we talked about your feelings of loneliness in your marriage, Ashley. Today, I want to delve into the very moment of betrayal, the moment you made this decision. What motivated you? Ashley sighed heavily, her hands nervously fiddling with the fabric of her dress. I don't know. It was selfish. Stupid. I didn't want to destroy the family, but I felt... She paused, searching for words, invisible. I was looking for confirmation that I was still desired, that I... Did you want to feel needed? The doctor said softly. She nodded. Mark grimaced, barely containing his irritation. And you found this confirmation between the legs of another man. His voice was full of poison. Ashley winced, but didn't look away. Dr. Harris turned his gaze to Mark. I understand that this is painful, Mark, but if we want to understand what happened, we will have to be completely honest. He paused, then calmly asked, Ashley, did you enjoy having sex with another man? Mark jerked his head up, his eyes flashing with anger. What the hell? Calm down, the doctor said firmly. This is an important question. Ashley held her breath, her face flushing with embarrassment. It wasn't about sex, she muttered. It was about attention. That I felt wanted, that someone was looking at me with admiration. But there was sex, Mark responded coldly, and you liked it. Ashley closed her eyes, as if afraid to tell the truth. It was different, not like with you. Differently, Mark grinned, his voice full of sarcasm. So tell me straight, was he better than me, more than me? Did you have more fun? Ashley sank into her chair, head down. Mark, answer, he demanded. Dr. Harris raised his hand to signal calm. Ashley, I understand this is a difficult question, but Mark has a right to know. She was silent for a long time. Then, dully, as if the words were stuck in her throat, she whispered, "It was. Not that important. At that moment, I didn't think about comparison. It was not passion, not love. It was an escape, and I'm sorry, more than I can explain." Mark was breathing heavily, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles were white. He felt chaos inside himself, hatred, humiliation, but at the same time something else. Something he couldn't fully comprehend. Dr. Harris nodded. "I know it's difficult, but today we took an important step. We began to examine not only the betrayal itself, but also its consequences for both of you. Mark, you are angry, but you continue to come to these sessions. It means something is keeping you here." Mark didn't answer. He didn't know why he was still here. Dr. Harris paused and waited for Mark to calm down a little, put his pen in his jacket pocket, and leaned back in his chair. His gaze slid over the worried faces of both spouses and lingered on Ashley. "Let's continue," he began softly, trying to maintain a calm atmosphere. "I understand that the conversation is extremely painful, but if we want to figure it out and understand whether you are ready to build further relationships, we need to be honest. So, Ashley, you said it was an escape. You were looking for a feeling of need and attention. But what exactly about this escape brought you a feeling of satisfaction? Was the sexual act itself an important part of this process?" Ashley looked away, blushing. "It was important for me to feel that they were looking at me with desire," she answered, trying to speak evenly. "Maybe this is a small thing for some, but when in marriage you feel invisible." She glanced briefly at Mark. Sometimes even superficial attention seems like a real salvation. "So, was it the other man's desire that was important?" the doctor asked carefully. "Yes," she whispered. Mark grinned evilly and crossed his arms over his chest. Dr. Harris glanced at him, but seeing that Mark was not going to comment, he turned back to Ashley. "You said you didn't compare him to Mark. But let's say this clearly. During sexual intimacy with your lover, did you feel physical satisfaction? Did you really enjoy having sex with him?" Ashley frowned, her eyes darting between the doctor and Mark. "I." She took a deep breath, as if gathering her courage. "I can't say that he was better or worse. It was just different. I was excited not so much by the process itself, but by the feeling that I was wanted. Of course, the sex itself also brought pleasure, but—" She stopped, her eyes filled with tears. "It was wrong, I know." Mark clenched his jaw and looked at the floor, hiding the emotions that flared in his eyes. "Brought pleasure. So I didn't satisfy you," he muttered, still avoiding looking directly at Ashley. She shook her head. "No, that's not the point. You are satisfied, but I felt that we had become strangers. And at that moment, I didn't know how to tell you how painful it was for me to feel lonely next to my own husband." Dr. Harris leaned forward, clasping his hands. "We come to a very important part, comparison. Mark asked a direct question: was your lover better, more? Let's be clear. What was your intimate relationship like with Mark before you cheated? Did you feel physical dissatisfaction, or was it really just a matter of emotional distance?" Ashley swallows nervously. "I wasn't looking for a better lover in physical terms. Honestly, I never thought about size or technique. I lacked emotions. I felt unwanted, and he, another person, complimented me, looked at me as if I was special. And this turned out to be decisive." Mark raised his head sharply, bitterness rang in his voice. "So, as soon as someone said a few beautiful words to you, you immediately went to bed?" Ashley closed her eyes. "I deserve this accusation," she whispered. Dr. Harris raised his hand in silence. "Mark, let's let her finish. Ashley, I want you to answer a few more questions, and I ask that you be as open as possible. Why did you choose treason? Did you feel that Mark was no longer satisfying you emotionally and physically, or was it more of an impulsive decision dictated by resentment and the desire to receive confirmation of one's importance?" Ashley sighed, lost in memories. "It was all at once, both resentment and impulse. We didn't have a heart-to-heart talk for a long time. Our problems were piling up, and I just broke down. I didn't think I'd get to this point. But at some point, I didn't care. I wanted to feel alive, at least for a moment. The doctor nodded. Tell me, did you ever think about discussing this with Mark before things got this far? Maybe visit a psychologist like we do now, but before. Ashley clasped her hands and slumped her shoulders. Probably yes. But it seemed to me that Mark had no time for me. He worked a lot, came home irritated or tired. I believed that I had no right to demand attention, and in the end, I found this way out. Mark frowned, but a shadow of doubt appeared in the depths of his gaze. Were you really trying to tell me? I was trying to. Hint, she muttered, but maybe not too persistently. And when that man caught my eye, he literally pursued me with compliments, hints, and I was too weak to resist it. Dr. Harris wrote something down on his notepad, then looked back at them both. It is important to understand that betrayal is not an option. But since it happened, now we must deal with its consequences. Mark, I see how hurt you are and how angry you are. But you are still here in these sessions despite all the pain. How do you feel when you hear that Ashley wasn't looking for the best physically, but the best emotionally? When she says that she lacked attention and warmth? Mark sighed heavily and ran his hand through his hair. I feel angry, and I'm offended. I was also lonely in a sense. I also felt misunderstood, but he didn't go left. He closed his eyes, trying to cope with his emotions. Yes, perhaps I am guilty of something. I can admit that I didn't spend much time with her. I was busy with work, but this is not an excuse. She betrayed me, and this is the worst thing. Dr. Harris nodded, allowing Mark to speak, and then turned back to Ashley. I'll ask one more, perhaps unpleasant, question, but it's important to bring all the details to light. Ashley, you mentioned that you didn't feel much passion, but still, can you directly say whether you felt good at the moment of intimacy, or was it more a way to prove to yourself that you are interesting than physical pleasure? Ashley hunched over, as if under the weight of guilt. I felt good, but not because he was superior to Mark or anything like that. Rather, because I felt like a woman desired. It's hard to explain. I know what that sounds like, and it's terrible. But that's how it was, and I'm sorry. Mark clenched his fists, but remained silent. Dr. Harris closed his notebook and looked at both of them calmly. Today, we touched on the most painful points, but without this, you won't be able to move forward. Next time, we'll talk about how to restore or perhaps rebuild your interactions. Mark, this conversation is a test for you, but if there is even the slightest desire to save the marriage, you will have to endure it to the end. Ashley, you also need to be willing to answer honestly, even the most awkward questions, if you want to regain trust. He stood up and, sensing the tense atmosphere, suggested, let's stop for today. Think about what was said. An important part of therapy is not only speaking the truth, but also learning to build new ways of communication. Mark and Ashley stood up in silence. There was still bitterness, resentment, and hidden hope in the air that the open wound could someday heal. Mark didn't know why he agreed. Ashley cautiously suggested looking back at old photos, saying it might remind them of what they used to be like. He wanted to refuse, to say that it was pointless, but something in her voice made him remain silent. Or perhaps he was just tired of the constant tension between them. Now they were sitting in the living room, an old family album lay in front of them. Mark held a glass of whiskey, the ice in which had almost melted, and Ashley slowly leafed through the pages, her fingers barely touching the glossy photographs, as if she was afraid of destroying something fragile. Do you remember this day? She smiled, showing a picture where they stood on the beach, hugging. This was our first vacation together. Mark leaned closer, looking at himself in the photo. He was different, then relaxed, genuinely happy. He remembered how they ran along the sand, how he picked her up in his arms, and she squealed with delight. How they sat around the fire, sharing dreams that then seemed so real, so achievable. The memory made the corners of his lips twitch upward, but he immediately pulled himself together and returned the coldness to his expression. Yes, he answered briefly, taking a sip of whiskey. Ashley sighed and turned the page. In the photo, they were having a picnic in the park. She sat on the blanket, laughing at something, and he looked at her with genuine tenderness. He remembered how that day they got lost on the way to that very park, how they laughed when the GPS suddenly turned off, and how they eventually chose a place near a large oak tree where they spent the whole day. That was the day you said you wanted children. Her voice became quieter. Mark felt his chest tighten. He really wanted it then. I wanted to be with her. Everything seemed so simple, so right. He remembered how they discussed what they would name their children, what kind of eyes they would have, what school they would choose. He even saw in Ashley the very woman who could become an ideal mother. Then he was sure that she would never betray him. Times change, he said, looking away. Ashley turned to him. Sadness flashed in her eyes, but there was no usual despair. She just looked at him carefully, as if trying to understand if there was still a chance that he could feel anything. Yes, they are changing, but something remains. Mark, tell me honestly, do these moments mean nothing to you anymore? He wanted to say no, he wanted to lie. But damn it, he couldn't. He looked at the photographs again, at his own face in the past, and felt something inside him tremble. He remembered those nights when they fell asleep in an embrace, her hands, her smell, that comfort that he could not find anywhere else. He remembered what he was like then, a man who knew how to love. I don't know, he finally breathed. Ashley nodded and closed the album. But before putting it away, she paused on one photo. It was their wedding. She is in a white dress. He is in a perfectly fitting suit. Both glow with happiness. They looked at each other as if no one existed in the world except the two of them. I don't know either, Mark, she said quietly, running her fingers over the photo. But if we both don't know, maybe this means that all is not lost. Mark didn't answer. He simply finished his whiskey, feeling two forces fighting inside him, the past and the present. And he wasn't sure which one would win. Mark noticed the changes. They did not happen immediately, not abruptly, but smoothly, almost imperceptibly, like warm water that gradually heats up until it becomes scalding. He still didn't trust Ashley, still kept her at a distance, but something in their interaction had changed. Previously, he felt her presence as an annoying noise. She simply existed in the house, carried out her duties, and tried not to catch his eye. But now he felt her. Her look when she thought he didn't notice. Her breath when they accidentally ended up in the same room. Her movements were too careful, as if she was afraid to scare him away. And there were also touches. They started out innocently. She passed him a cup of coffee, her fingers barely touching his palm. She passed by in the narrow corridor, lightly brushing his shoulder. One day he was sitting at the kitchen table, concentrating on typing something on his laptop, when he felt her hand lightly touch his back. It was just a moment short, almost imperceptible, but he felt it. Previously, he would have pulled his hand back, moved away, and said something caustic. But now, he didn't move. Mark didn't understand what was happening to him. He was angry at himself for allowing these moments to linger in his memory. He tried to convince himself that it didn't matter, that it was still too fresh, too painful. And yet, her every touch left behind a strange warmth that I didn't want to throw away. He noticed something else. Sometimes, when she thought he wasn't looking, her lips would tremble, as if she wanted to say something but didn't dare. He saw how she closed her eyes after another accidental touch, as if trying to hold on to the moment. But he still wasn't ready. Not now. One evening, he walked into the living room and saw Ashley curled up on the couch with a book. Her hair was pulled back into a messy bun, and there was a look of fatigue on her face. She looked at him and smiled. Not broadly, not confidently, but carefully, as if she was testing his reaction. He felt something clench inside him. "Would you like some tea?" she asked quietly. He nodded. This was the first time in a long time. The first time he allowed himself to accept her care. The conversation happened unexpectedly. They sat in the kitchen, drinking tea. It was one of those rare nights when the tension between them eased a little. The silence was not oppressive, but rather cautious, filled with unresolved questions. It seemed that the air between them became denser, as if before a thunderstorm. Mark looked at the mug in his hands. Then, without looking up, he calmly said, "Have you thought about what you will do if the child is not mine?" Ashley winced. She clearly hadn't expected this question, but judging by the way her fingers tightened their grip on the handle of the cup, he knew she was thinking about it. "I thought for a long time." "Yes," her voice was quiet. "I will go to my mother." Mark slowly raised his head, peering into her face. "Will you just leave?" There was something between surprise and irritation in his voice. Ashley took a deep breath, as if preparing for a difficult conversation. "What else should I do, Mark? Stay here, seeing your face every day, knowing that the child is not yours, watch you hate me even more." Her eyes darkened with emotion. "I don't want to cause you more pain, and I don't want to. I don't want to force you to live with a child that doesn't belong to you." He bit the inside of his cheek. Something in her voice touched him. Determination, sadness, or maybe fear. "You understand that after this, we will never see each other again?" he said coldly. Ashley looked down and nodded. "Yes, understand." Mark clenched his fingers into a fist. He expected anything. Tears, hysteria, attempts to persuade him, but not such calm. She had already made her decision. She had already mentally said goodbye. He took a sip of tea, but the taste seemed bland to him. He felt everything boiling inside. Why did this make him so angry? Because he expected a fight. Did he expect that she would beg him to stay, that she would look for a way out? But no, she has already decided everything. And for some reason, this angered him more than any of her betrayals. "You're not fighting," he said. "You just give up." Ashley looked up at him. Fatigue splashed through them. "Do you want me to fight? Did you give me at least one chance?" Her voice trembled, but she did not raise it, did not shout. "You despise me, Mark, and perhaps you have every right to do so. I destroyed us, but I don't want to ruin your life any further. If the child is not yours, I will leave. I won't hold on to something that's already broken." Mark clenched his jaw, trying to suppress his emotions. He hated this conversation. He hated the fact that they had to discuss such things. Was it his child or not? Should he hope, or prepare for the fact that she will leave forever? "When will you leave?" he asked sharply. Ashley clenched her fingers on the cup, as if clinging to it as if it were the last point of support. "As soon as I get the DNA results. I'm not going to force you to take anything. I just want to know the truth." Mark turned away, barely containing his anger. The whole situation seemed wrong and painful to him. He wanted to just turn around and leave, but something forced him to stay. The question to which he was afraid to hear the answer. What if the child is still his? Then what? Can he live with her? Forgive? Give it a chance? He didn't know that either. All day Mark felt a growing tension. It seemed as if the air in the house had thickened, and every glance, every word only fueled the fire inside him. He tried to keep his distance, but something bothered him. Ashley was also tense, but tried not to get into conflicts. However, in the evening, everything fell through. "Why do you walk around with that face?" she suddenly said when he silently put the plate in the sink. "What is this?" His voice sounded harsh, evil, detached. "You act like I don't exist, and then you look at me like you're expecting me to say or do something wrong." Her voice was filled with anger. Mark exhaled in irritation. "What do you want, Ashley? So I can pretend that everything is okay, to forget that you—" He clenched his teeth without finishing. "I'm not asking you to forget," Ashley raised her voice. "But you act as if I'm already sentenced, as if I'm a mistake that you simply have to endure. I'm trying to fix something, but you don't even give me a chance." Mark clenched his fists. Anger and an incomprehensible storm of emotions boiled inside him. He didn't know what to say because every word got stuck in his throat. "What if I don't want to give you a chance?" he barked, coming closer. "Have you thought about this? I was thinking that I can't just take it and forget. I can't just take it and trust you again." They stood in front of each other, breathing heavily. Their gazes collided, filled with anger, pain, understatement. Ashley suddenly stepped closer, and before Mark knew what was happening, she grabbed him by the shirt and pulled him towards her. Their lips collided not softly, not tenderly, but desperately, with an admixture of pain, anger, and some kind of unbearable melancholy. Mark didn't push her away. His body betrayed his mind, and the next second his hands were squeezing her waist, pulling her closer. He felt the taste of her breath, her warmth, her trembling. It wasn't right, but damn, it was real. But after a moment, he pulled away abruptly, as if waking up. He looked at her with wide eyes as she caught her breath, her lips still parted. Damn, he whispered, taking a step back. Ashley didn't move. Only her eyes shone in the twilight of the kitchen. This shouldn't have happened, Mark breathed, clenching his fingers into fists. He turned and quickly walked out of the room, leaving Ashley alone in the midst of a chaos of emotions that they both could not control. After that kiss, Mark couldn't stop thinking about Ashley. Her lips, her breathing, the heat that flared up between them, all this did not give him peace. He was angry at himself, at her, at their situation. But the worst thing was that he began to notice how his anger was gradually being replaced by something else. Something he didn't want to admit. Consultations with the family therapist continued. At each session, Dr. Harris patiently addressed their emotions and helped them make sense of their feelings. "You both have strong emotions for each other," he said at one of the sessions. "Anger, pain, resentment, all this often goes hand in hand with passion. Your feelings have not cooled down, Mark. They have changed, but have not disappeared." Mark wanted to object, but he knew Harris was right. Ashley still evoked emotions in him too strong, too intense to simply ignore. Mark couldn't sleep. It seemed to him that the thoughts inside his head were louder than the beating of his own heart. He got out of bed to somehow distract himself and walked barefoot into the kitchen. He poured some water and leaned his elbows on the countertop. But the cold liquid did not quench the thirst that burned him from the inside. He heard light footsteps before he saw her silhouette. Ashley stood at the window, her back turned to him, in a long t-shirt falling off one shoulder. The soft street light snatched her figure from the twilight, making her image almost ghostly, somehow unreal, and at the same time terribly close. Mark's heart began to beat faster. With every breath, he felt more and more keenly the faint aroma of her hair and skin, the smell that had once been most dear to him. He wanted to touch her, cuddle up to her, inhale this aroma deeper. And suddenly she turned around. Her eyes, shining from the reflection of the lantern, met his gaze. At that moment, everything that had been holding him back for so many months, resentment, pain, anger, collapsed, crumbling like dry sand. He didn't remember who made the first move. Perhaps it was her, or perhaps he himself. But the very next second, Ashley found herself between him and the wall, and their lips merged in a frantic, desperate kiss. She moaned quietly, hoarsely, biting his lip, as if she wanted to cause him pleasant pain in order to take out all the accumulated resentment and at the same time show how madly she needed him. Mark responded by only pressing her closer to him, feeling the heat of her body appearing through the thin fabric of her t-shirt. "Damn, Ash," he breathed, unable to find any other words. She ran her palms down his back, her nails hooking, leaving light scratches. As if she was testing how real he was, how much he could withstand her passion. He moaned into her lips, and in this groan you could hear everything. Anger at the situation, a wild craving for her, and insane relief from the fact that she was now in his hands. Mark's hands slid down, catching the hem of her t-shirt, and he unceremoniously pulled it over her head. Ashley arched, pressing her whole body against him. His skin burned under her touch. She greedily stroked his chest, shoulders, and ran her fingers along his neck. "Damn it," she whispered, opening her mouth slightly to gasp for air. How I missed this." He responded with a short groan, biting her lower lip, feeling her trembling, but not from the cold, from the rolling desire. They moved in the dim space of the kitchen, bumping into the table, almost knocking over the dishes. But they didn't care at that moment. The whole world shrank to two. "Tell me that you want this," Mark blurted out. He himself did not understand what exactly he was trying to achieve. Statements? Permissions? probably all at once. I want this, her voice almost became hoarse. Want you. To hell with everything. He pressed her back against the cool wall. The contrast between the cold and her hot body cut her skin, but did not stop her for a moment. She wrapped her legs around his hips and tangled her fingers in his hair, pulling him into another frantic kiss. It was almost painful, such a flash of passion, as if they were trying to suck from each other's lips all the resentment and guilt that had accumulated over months of estrangement. Damn, he croaked. Ash, the words are over. All that remained were touches, moans, muffled exhalations, and the beating of hearts. He covered her neck with hot kisses, went down to her collarbones, repeated her name in a whisper, interspersing it with confused curses. She scratched his shoulders, sometimes silently cursing in response, and in these dirty words there was so much pain and relief at the same time that he squeezed her even harder. Each word became a new impetus, both literally and metaphorically, to lose myself in this crazy merger. When the tension finally reached its limit, they both stopped breathing for a moment, stopping as if all the air had left their lungs at once. At that moment, everything inside both of them exploded. Passion, anger, resentment, everything mixed into one deafening surge of feelings, and they drowned in it without trying to escape. After some time, it seemed like an eternity, but in fact only a few minutes, Mark slowly sank to the floor, pulling Ashley with him. They lay there, on the cool tiles, pressed against each other, panting, as if after a long run. "Did we just do something wrong?" she asked quietly. Mark was silent. He didn't know whether it was a step forward or a mistake, but for the first time in a long time, he felt not emptiness, but something completely different. The next day, Mark felt like a different person. A few hours ago, he could not tear himself away from Ashley. His hands themselves reached out to her, and now he again felt the same wall that he had been building between them for so long. He reminded himself that he couldn't trust her. He reminded me that there would be a DNA test soon. This word could not leave his head, reminding him that their entire current situation was just a temporary lull before the inevitable verdict. At breakfast, he sat opposite her, holding a cup of coffee. She looked at him with a cautious smile, but he did not answer her in kind. Instead, he took a sip, looking out the window. It was gray and cloudy outside, as if nature itself sensed his inner storm. "You're pulling away again," Ashley said quietly, putting her fork down on her plate. Her voice was level, but pain flashed in her eyes. Mark tightened his fingers on the cup. "I'm just thinking," he answered evenly. "About what?" She looked at him, but he did not look up. "About the future," he said after a long pause. "About what will happen after the DNA test." Ashley looked down, her fingers clenching nervously on the edge of the table. "I understand." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Understand? Don't think. You just live in hope that I can forget everything. But I can't. I can't just erase what you did from my mind." His voice was hoarse, and there was tension in it. She pursed her lips, not trying to justify herself. She knew his trust had been broken, and he understood that, despite their rapprochement, fear of the future had not disappeared. On the contrary, he became stronger. "I don't expect you to forget, Mark," Ashley finally said quietly. "I just hope that someday you can stop hating me." He glanced sharply at her. "It's not about hatred," he said. "The thing is, I don't know how to trust you again. I don't know what will happen next. If the child is not mine." Ashley tensed, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. "If it's not yours, I'll leave, Mark. I won't stop you from moving on with your life." "Okay," he answered dryly, feeling something squeezing unpleasantly in his chest. Mark was lost in thought all day. He left for work earlier than usual and stayed late, deliberately avoiding returning home. He couldn't work in the office. He looked at the laptop screen, but the words and numbers lost their meaning. He knew that the question that troubled him could not be solved by logic. He had no control over the test result. All he could do was wait. When he returned home, the lights were dim in the living room, and the untouched plate of dinner that Ashley had left for him sat on the table. He felt a strange pang in his chest, but immediately suppressed it. He couldn't afford to lose control again. Not yet. Time passed, the days dragged on slowly, but inexorably brought them closer to the moment of truth. Ashley became more and more vulnerable. Her movements slowed down, fatigue appeared more often on her face. Pregnancy took a lot of energy from her, but she tried not to show it. Mark noticed how it became increasingly difficult for her to tie her shoelaces, how she struggled to get up from the sofa, how from time to time a grimace of pain appeared on her face, but she did not say anything, and he is also silent. He took care of her as best he could. I bought groceries and made sure that the house always had everything I needed. When he noticed that it was difficult for her to walk up the stairs, he unobtrusively offered his help. Sometimes I left tea with honey on the table for her, knowing that she had trouble sleeping at night. He did this silently, without words, and without unnecessary glances. He couldn't afford to open his heart completely to her again, but he couldn't leave her without support either. Ashley felt it. She noticed his gestures, but did not try to overestimate them. It was enough for her that he was nearby, that he did not turn away completely. She knew that he was still struggling with himself, with feelings that he could not completely bury. But something in their relationship began to change. He still kept his distance, but not so sharply. His hands no longer shook with anger when he accidentally touched her. He still avoided looking into her eyes for too long, but sometimes, when she wasn't looking, he found himself staring at her rounded belly, her hair falling in front of her face, the way she bit her lip when she was lost in thought. He was angry with himself for these moments, but he couldn't stop himself. One night Mark woke up from a faint noise. He walked out of the bedroom and saw her in the living room, sitting on the couch, rubbing her stomach, her eyes filled with emotions that he couldn't read. He wanted to go back, but froze. Her voice broke the silence. "He often moves at night," she said quietly, without raising her head, as if he was already ready to be born. Mark was silent, looking at her. There was something achingly warm about the scene. He felt a thin thread of connection appearing between them again. He wanted to say something, but the words got stuck in his throat. "Are you afraid?" he asked after a long pause. She nodded. "Afraid, and not just childbirth." She took a deep breath, squeezing her fingers on her stomach. "I'm afraid of the moment when we find out the truth." Mark ran his hand over his face, sighing tiredly. "Me too." He sat next to her, not touching, not moving closer, but their breaths were already close enough to feel each other's warmth. He looked at her belly, at her thin fingers gently stroking the roundness, and suddenly realized that he could not imagine his life without this moment, without her. The thought scared him, but what scared him even more was the fact that he knew that despite everything, he still loved her. A few more days passed. Ashley became increasingly quiet and thoughtful. One evening, she stayed in the bathroom longer than usual, and Mark, worried, knocked on the door. "Ashley, everything is fine?" "Yes, I'm just a little tired." Her voice sounded muffled. But when she came out, her eyes were red. He didn't ask if she was crying. She didn't explain. But that evening, when they ran into each other in the hallway, Mark raised his hand for the first time in a long time and brushed a stray strand of hair from her face. She froze, holding her breath, and he simply nodded and went into his room. Mark never considered himself a person who was afraid. He had gone through betrayal, hatred, pain, but now, sitting in the sterile corridor of the maternity ward, he felt fear squeezing his chest like an iron hoop. It seemed to him that time had stopped. The clock on the wall ticked unbearably slowly, each minute stretching into eternity. Ashley screamed outside the door. This sound pierced right through him. He clenched his fists, trying not to think about the fact that he couldn't do anything. The feeling of helplessness weighed on him more than he expected. The nurse came out several times, giving short, professionally calm glances. "Everything is going according to plan," she said one day, but this meant nothing to Mark. He was too immersed in his thoughts. What if the child is not his? What if the DNA test destroys the thin thread that he and Ashley managed to restore? What if? What if he couldn't let go of this baby, whoever he was? Suddenly, the screen was replaced by a sound that made him freeze. Child's cry. Mark rose from his seat, not immediately realizing what he was doing. My heart was beating wildly, my blood was pounding in my temples. He never thought that just one sound could change him so much. A few minutes later, the door opened, and the doctor walked out into the corridor. There was a slight smile on his face. "Congratulations, you have a son." Mark blinked as if he couldn't believe his ears. "Son?" His voice sounded hoarse, almost unrecognizable. The doctor nodded. "Everything went well. Mother and child feel fine. You can come in." Mark entered the room, not knowing what to expect. Ashley lay on the bed, looking exhausted but happy. In her hands, wrapped in a blanket, lay a small, pink lump. She looked up, and in her eyes he saw everything: fear, joy, hope. "Do you want to hold him?" she asked, barely audible. He didn't answer. He just walked over slowly and carefully took the baby in his arms. The moment he looked into the tiny child, something inside him turned over. The lab lobby seemed to be several degrees colder than usual. Mark felt the unreality of the situation pressing on him. Every sound, every rustle echoed in his ears. Hundreds of thoughts floated around in confusion in his head, while he clutched a thin envelope in his hands, inside of which was the answer to the question that had been tormenting him and Ashley for the past months. They were invited into a small room, modestly furnished. A table, 2 chairs, a small sink, and some medical equipment along the wall. Apparently, this is where they had to wait for a laboratory representative who would talk about the test, describe the results, and answer possible questions. Ashley held a baby in her arms, wrapped in a soft white blanket. The baby snored quietly, sometimes winced with displeasure, and opened his eyes slightly, as if he understood that something was happening. "I'll be right there," Mark said in a whisper, smiling uncertainty at Ashley. He went out into the corridor to take a breath and calm down a little. On the walls hung posters advertising genetic tests, promising services ranging from establishing kinship to creating personalized diets. It seemed that this world of laboratory research was infinitely far from the chaos of feelings that was now raging in his soul. After being discharged from the hospital, Mark almost did not find a place for himself. Life changed rapidly. Instead of the usual worries about work, meetings, and plans, everything moved to the plane of a new reality, into the world of a tiny child with his fragility and helplessness. In the room they had previously arranged for the baby, there was a cradle, and there was the smell of baby lotion and clean diapers. But these pleasant details were drowned in oppressive anxiety. Every evening, when Ashley finally fell into a short, light sleep, Mark sat in the living room with his head in his hands. The thought that there was now a child in his house who might not be his was driving him crazy. He understood that he should trust Ashley, but the terrible "what if" did not give him peace. Scenes of their quarrels flashed before my eyes, moments when they were so close to breaking up that it seemed that nothing could be returned. Many times during those nights he tried to imagine what would happen if the test showed a disappointing result. How will he react? Will he be able to forgive? And if the child is still his, will he find the strength to believe that this crisis in their relationship is really over? She felt every bit of his tension and saw how he did not dare to approach the child again, as if afraid of becoming attached ahead of time. Often I would wake up in the middle of the night, slip out of the bedroom, and find Mark sitting at the table, staring into space. She didn't know how to help him. Her own fears pierced her heart. If the test showed that Mark was not the father, then their marriage would probably cease to exist. It seemed to her that the misunderstanding between them was growing like an impassable chasm. Sometimes she wanted to persuade him to abandon this idea, but she understood. As long as the question hung in the air, it would corrode their relationship. We need the truth. They had to settle this once and for all. The day of the test has arrived. Ashley had a hard time bringing herself to eat. Mark hardly said a word at breakfast. There was a noticeable tension behind him, as if he had a knot tied inside him that could not be untangled. They got into the car and quietly drove to the laboratory. The road seemed longer than usual. The child behaved surprisingly calmly, as if realizing that his parents were on the verge of a nervous breakdown. In the nurse's office, everything happened almost like lightning. They took a DNA sample from the child, from Mark, from Ashley. Then there was a short speech about when the results would be ready, followed by nods of farewell. But this short interaction was filled with such tension that Mark left the office as if he had crawled out of there. The days of waiting turned into a test of strength. Ashley kept glancing at her phone, as if checking to see if an email had arrived. Mark kept himself under control, but inside he was torn by anxiety. He tried to spend time with the child, changing diapers, putting him to bed, even once helping Ashley give the baby a bath. At these moments, he felt how much he already loved the baby, how important it was for him to be there. But at the same moment, a feeling of guilt for his own doubts and suspicions suffocated him from within. At night, she again heard his steps in the living room, and sometimes, unable to restrain herself, she would quietly come up and lay her hand on his shoulder to feel his warm breath and remember that before all these problems, they were a happy, loving couple. When the letter from the laboratory arrived, Mark was sitting in the nursery, looking at photographs of happy moments of their family life on his laptop. He desperately searched for memories that could give him confidence in their relationship again. But every photo screamed how things had changed. He fell silent when he heard the warning signal. My heart sank. He looked at the screen for several seconds. Genitas Laboratory, the results are ready. He couldn't believe that this very moment had come. But as he understood, it was no longer possible to delay it any longer. Opening the letter, he saw an attached file with a formal name. Clicking on it, he ran his eyes over the text, not yet realizing what he had read. 99%. The child was his, without a doubt. As if stunned, he sat staring at these numbers. And then everything in his soul collapsed, and at the same time fell into place. Fear, anxiety, shame, everything was mixed and flowed with a hot wave of relief. He didn't immediately hear Ashley's steps. She stood in the doorway, clutching the frame with her palms, afraid to take an extra step. Mark? Her voice was quiet, as if she was afraid to frighten away hope. He turned around, and their eyes met. In this silence, filled with the rhythmic breathing of the baby, it was as if they could hear each other without words. Mark just nodded and exhaled. He's mine. Ashley burst into tears. All the difficult emotions that she had been storing up inside came out in these tears. She walked up to Mark and, without letting go of the child, knelt down next to his chair. Mark carefully hugged her and the baby, holding them close to him, as if wanting to make up for all those weeks and months when doubts accumulated in him. At that moment, it seemed that all the accumulated negativity had dissipated, like clouds of fog under the morning sun. They didn't talk about the past or the reasons for his fears. They just understood that everything was finally over. After the test results confirmed that the child was his, something inside Mark finally broke down, or, conversely, got fixed. All this time he had been holding on to cold self-control, to anger, to fear, but now he had no reason left to continue to hate. He looked at Ashley, thin, tired, but still so dear, and realized that he did not want to lose her. I can't live in this hatred anymore, he said one evening as they sat in the living room. I tried to convince myself that I didn't care, that it's all over between us, but this is not true. Ashley looked at him with hidden hope, but did not dare to speak first. I forgive you, Mark said quietly. Not for the sake of the child, not because it's necessary, but because I want to be with you. I want us to try again. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but this time they were tears of relief. She covered his hand with hers, squeezing it as if she was afraid he would change his mind. The next day he went to court and withdrew the divorce petition. Signing the papers, Mark felt calm for the first time in a long time. The future no longer seemed so scary. That evening, sitting on the sofa with the baby in his arms, he suddenly realized they still hadn't chosen a name. We still haven't decided what to call him, he chuckled, looking at his son's tiny face. Ashley smiled as she ran her fingers over the baby's head. Do you have any ideas? Mark thought for a moment, and then, looking at his wife, said, Let's choose together. This time, no mistakes. They went through the names for a long time, remembering those that they had discussed once in the distant past. Mark suggested several strict options, Ashley was leaning towards something softer. In the end, after much deliberation, they agreed on one thing. "What about Liam?" Ashley suggested, looking at her husband. Mark looked at the baby, then back at Ashley, and the corners of his lips twitched into a faint smile. "Liam," he repeated. "Yes, I like it." Ashley smiled and kissed her son's forehead. "Welcome to this world, Liam. Several months have passed. Life has not become ideal, but it has become real." Mark and Ashley were together again, but now they were different, more mature, more aware, more careful. Their relationship was no longer a naive tale of eternal love. They knew how fragile happiness can be, and therefore they treasured every moment. Liam grew up quickly. His first laugh was a new beginning for them. It was ringing, joyful, pure. It was the sound that filled their home with meaning. His every movement, every new sound became part of their common history. Ashley often watched Mark as he rocked his son, and at such moments tears appeared in her eyes. But now these were tears of happiness. Mark has changed. He no longer harbored anger or dwelled on the past. He looked at Ashley differently, with trust that was not there before, with the awareness that love is not just a word, but a choice that must be made every day. There were times when the pain of the past came back, but now they dealt with it together. One evening, they were sitting in the backyard, enjoying the warm summer air. Liam was sleeping in his stroller, and Mark was holding a bottle of beer, lazily swinging his leg. Ashley sat next to him, wrapped in a blanket, her head resting on his shoulder. "Are you happy?" she suddenly asked. Mark looked at her, then turned his gaze to his sleeping son. He was silent for a long time before answering. "Yes, for real." She smiled, lowering her eyes. "Me too." Mark took her hand, intertwining their fingers. They sat there in silence, listening to the wind, the sounds of the night, Liam's rare sighs. They didn't need words. They knew they had a future. They knew they had a second chance. And this time, they weren't going to let him go. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one.